Good evening and welcome to the July 23rd live edition of Garden Hour. Thank you so much for joining us on this lovely summer evening. Looks like we have a bit of a smoky or hazy sky, but 'tis the season, and perhaps we'll just be thankful that it's not downpouring anymore in eastern South Dakota. Although my understanding is in the western side of the state, you likely would like a little bit more rain just about now. Again, my name is Kristine Lang, and I'm an SDSU Extension Consumer Horticulture Specialist, and I'm also an assistant professor based here on the Brookings campus, but working statewide to assist you with cut flower and vegetable cropping needs. I'm really excited to be hosting tonight's Garden Hour because we have a new slate of invited guests. We have a familiar face in Sean Toporek, and then we have three different students who are joining us as well. So it's my pleasure to welcome as a newbie to Garden Hour, Blake Pulse, who is a master's student in the Department of Natural Resource Management. And I have the extreme pleasure of co-advising Blake with Dr. Jennifer Zavaleta-Cheek. And Blake is doing some really exciting research for his master's thesis. So Blake, what are you going to be telling us about tonight?
Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about my qualitative research chapter of my thesis, which is about increasing local food procurement in South Dakota school districts.
Awesome. So a slightly different flair from the Garden Hour theme, but I think we're going to see a lot of dots that connect. And then continuing the through line of the local foods discussion, it's also my pleasure to welcome Sean Toporek back to Garden Hour. Sean is an assistant professor of specialty crops pathology, and he is also the director of the South Dakota State Local Foods Education Center, which I think might be the theme tonight. And joining Sean is Liz DeBoer, who is the farm manager, and Liz Sattler, who is one of the student farmers on the team this year. So Sean and crew, what are you going to be sharing with us tonight?
I'm just going to be introducing what the local foods education center is and does, and then
I'm going to be talking about my cut flowers.
And I'm going to be talking about our no-till bed production.
there you go.
Awesome. So we're going to have some great things to learn from students. As always, a reminder for everyone, whatever your questions or curiosities are for any of our panelists, please drop that in the Q&A. Once they conclude their brief presentation, we'll open up the floor for a robust discussion because it's way more fun to listen to our panelists talk and answer your questions. And depending on how the time goes, I plan on rounding out the evening with some discussion of deer-resistant plants and some plants that are hardy to things like hail and fire. Kind of been sitting on that theme for a little bit, and I heard through the grapevine via Rhoda that folks had questions about deer-resistant plants. So I thought tonight would be a great night to tackle that. Without further ado, Blake, I'm going to turn the floor over to you so we can learn what in the world is qualitative research and what have you been up to in South Dakota?
Awesome. Thank you. So yeah, again, my name is Blake Pulse, graduate research assistant at SDSU, and I'm going to be talking about increasing local food procurement in South Dakota schools. So a little overview on kind of what I'm going to talk about. So I'll start off with some background context to the problem, talk through my methods, how I'm collecting my data and analyzing it, and then share some preliminary results. So taking a really big step back and looking at food insecurity on the national level. So despite being the richest country in the world, the United States still suffers from food insecurity. Around 13% of households in 2021, and a lot of those households have small children in them. So when we're looking at childhood food insecurity, we're looking at 17.3%. As we zoom in a little bit into South Dakota, South Dakota's childhood food insecurity rate is 1 in 9. But this is really disproportionately affecting children on South Dakota's reservations, where we're seeing 25% of children being food insecure. Food insecurity is a really important part when we're talking about school meals, because a lot of times food insecure children's the only meal they're going to receive in a day is a school provided meal. So it's really important to not only ensure that school meals are healthy, and nutritionally balanced, but also appetizing for students to make sure we're increasing consumption. South Dakotans also have really low fruit and vegetable consumption. We ranked 31st in the United States for fruit and vegetable consumption, and only 6% of South Dakotans are actually eating their recommended fruits and vegetable servings every day. I know your Garden Hour viewers are really great about eating their fruits and vegetables, but the larger population in South Dakota is not. So when we're talking local procurement, farm to school is really the most popular way that this gets brought up. In farm to school, it really does not refer to a single prescribed program model, meaning that you don't go online, check a box, and local food is showing up at your door. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but school districts and school food authorities can really participate in a variety of ways. And I think one of my participants said it best with farm to school is really whatever it means to your community. The USDA has laid out 3 objectives for farm to school. The first being school gardens, second being agricultural education, and then the focus of my project and the third objective is serving local food in school meals. Farm to school has many proven benefits to students, producers, and communities. Students are eating more at school meals, living healthier lifestyles, and showing more knowledge about nutrition and where their food comes from. Producers is a really important market for producers, and nationally has had a $12 billion economic impact. And on communities, money spent in the community is always a win. And it really provides meaningful connections between parents, schools, and producers. So despite all the benefits that come along with farm to school, South Dakota does fall behind national trends. So when we look at national trends in participation with farm to school, we're seeing 65% nationally. In South Dakota, we're at less than half. But there is some light coming to this as we are doing better than the national average when it comes to programs less than 3 years old. So it's newer in South Dakota with a lot of new programs. And then to kind of wrap up this slide, when it comes to supportive legislative policies, we've seen 46 of the 50 states pass policies saying, and these things are anything from a declaration saying farm to school is awesome, we think school districts should participate, to actually putting money towards subsidizing local procurement on the school district level. And so far in South Dakota, we have not seen any sort of policy. Admittedly, these numbers are not are a little old. They come from the 2019 farm to school census. So it's not the best representation, but the most accurate one we have right now. We're expecting the 2024 farm to school census to come this fall. So we're really excited to see what numbers look like in South Dakota post-pandemic. So now I'm going to talk through my methods. So again, all of my research is qualitative, meaning I have no numbers in my data. So my data comes from quotes through a series of focus groups and semi-structured interviews with stakeholders in the South Dakota local food system, as well as school food authorities and other partners so far. And we go in and we ask them questions and we ask them what are their biggest challenges? What are the opportunities? How can we solve them? We also have been conducting participant observations where we are going and participating in events, attending conferences, having casual conversations with stakeholders in the farm to school and local procurement. We then take the combination of the focus groups, the interviews, and the participant observations, and we analyze everything using grounded theory. And grounded theory is a qualitative analysis tool that we use to basically, we go in with no hypothesis. We don't do any sort of hypothesis testing. We just let the data speak for itself. So we look at all the data and we use them to identify common themes and topics. And the things that come up the most are considered our biggest challenges. So this slide here highlights a lot of our participants and collaborators. We have a really extensive network of people in state agencies, federal agencies, networks, associations, coalitions, and then, of course, on the extension side and education side as well. So now getting into some of our preliminary results, I'll talk about the obstacles that are preventing local food procurement in South Dakota. So starting off, labor shortages on the school side. So school lunchrooms really struggle to recruit and maintain staffing. Um, these are the people who are on the ground, making sure that all of the students are fed every single day. But it's really hard to entice people into working in school lunchrooms due to poor pay and only a 9-month contract. When school's not in session, they're not receiving a paycheck. And so when we're talking about local food does require more labor because these are the people who are also having to wash tomatoes or peel hard-boiled eggs or ground beef. So school labor shortage is one of the biggest factors involved here. The local food system is also experiencing labor shortages. Just in general, we do not have enough producers. Our producers really struggle to find labor to help harvest and process, which could take off some of the strain on our school lunchrooms. And of course, recruiting labor. And again, we're running into that seasonal employment as well. Local processing is another barrier preventing local procurement in South Dakota. South Dakota really just lacks the infrastructure that caters to local food. So when we're talking fruits and vegetables, there's not any large scale fruit and vegetable processing in the states as of now, which means that the producers have to do it or it falls on the school lunch staff. When we're talking some of our other products, meat processing is available, but yet limited and not able to keep up with the demand. But when we're talking meat processing for smaller animals such as poultry or rabbit, there's no processing in the state. Financing local food is also a concern that consistently has come up through our interviews. School food authorities have this buy cheap mindset, thinking they have to buy the cheapest thing on the market. Local food does come with a little bit of a higher price tag sometimes, and they think that they hear the term local and they think the price is going to be astronomical, when that's not always the case. A lot of this is due to just a lack of budget knowledge in general. School food authorities don't necessarily know the ins and outs of their budget and what they can afford, so they just default to buying the cheapest thing on the market, which happens to be the high processed, comes in a bag type of food. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, the USDA has also released additional funds for local procurement, so we see a lot more schools dabbling. But there are concerns too when it comes to the sustainability of those funding sources and how long the USDA will have those funds available. One of the coolest things, in my opinion, that we found so far in this research is beef to school in South Dakota is really the gateway. And that's really for a couple reasons. Beef is just more accessible in the state. Beef producers, there's more beef producers and there's more beef processors. So we see a lot of schools starting to get into farm to school through the avenue of beef. And that really inspires them to try the fruits and vegetables or the grains. And then finally, school size is a barrier. This is perhaps the most startling finding that we found so far. So looking at all the literature that exists and the studies that have come before mine, nationally looking at it, larger, more urban schools are more likely to procure local food. And in South Dakota, that's just not the case. We're seeing our smaller rural schools participating in local procurement at a higher rate than our larger schools in the state. And that's ultimately coming down to their storage capacity for local beef. Again, we're doing beef to school at a higher rate than other products. So, but it ultimately comes down to having the space to be able to store enough beef to feed an entire student body, which is a lot more obtainable for our smaller school districts than it is for our larger ones. And another piece to the beef to larger schools is scratch cooking is a lot more difficult on a larger scale. Again, a lot more attainable for our smaller school districts in the state. So to kind of conclude, this research would not be possible without our funding source, the Regional Food Systems Partnership, my advisors and committee members, Dr. Jennifer Zavaleta-Cheek, Dr. Kristine Lang, and Dr. Jeff Bastian, my undergrad research assistant, Kaylee Lozier, and our partners at the South Dakota Local Foods Coalition, who have been awesome participants and collaborators throughout this research project. And finally, to end, increasing local food procurement in South Dakota school districts will ensure healthy, nutritious, appetizing food for South Dakota kids. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Blake. At this time, I'll open it up for audience questions. If anyone's curious about any aspect of Blake's research, his findings, how all of that works. Blake, if anyone is listening and has a connection to farm to school activities in their community in South Dakota, or, you know, might be open to an interview or things like that, how does that process work and how might they get a hold of you?
Yeah, so we're always interested in interviewing more people, hearing different perspectives from around the state. The best way is to probably email me and reach out to let me know what your involvement is with farm to school and local procurement, and we would be happy to set up an interview.
Excellent. And for our audience, feel free to get a hold of Blake. He would be accessible through the South Dakota State University directory. And I also dropped his email in the chat, but realized I did. Thank you, Candy. I appreciate that. So blake.pulse@sdstate.edu. Blake, I know you travel across the state for this work. Have you had any favorite places you visited, or some real aha moments or pockets of diamonds in the rough that you found with this farm to school work?
Yeah, I definitely think a highlight for me was I got to spend kind of a week just traveling around West River, South Dakota, and just emailed them as many people as I could, trying to set up interviews. Got a bunch of interviews that week, learned a ton, got to sit in on some really fascinating meetings, and overall learned just a ton that week, talking to a lot of school food authorities on the western side of the state.
Awesome. And I can say that Blake has built himself up as a little bit of a South Dakota celebrity. I had some school food authorities tour our campus research plots, and they had nothing but good things to say about Blake. So Blake, we do have a couple of questions, and I'm going to go in reverse order. Do you have any more thoughts or insights on larger schools using less local foods, and how that, other reasons you think that might be flipped here in South Dakota versus other states?
Yeah, so in other states, we're seeing those larger schools are doing a lot more fruits and vegetables, and that's just not as accessible in South Dakota here. There are a couple examples of schools in South Dakota, larger schools that are doing the fruits and vegetables and really making an effort to do so. But a lot of those other states also have the processing infrastructure that cater directly towards schools. So I'll take New York, for example, way bigger state, but they have a whole processing facility that's packaging and washing all the fruits and vegetables and shipping it to schools. So all the school lunch staff is having to do is take that local food that's already pre-washed, pre-cut, and put it right on the salad bar, or put it in whatever meal that it's showing up in.
Excellent, Blake. That's a helpful insight. And this next question, I'll welcome you to take a stab at it first, but let me know if you'd like me to weigh in as well. So someone was curious, is there a problem with locally grown foods and inspection requirements by schools? So what does that look like?
Yeah, not How about you take a stab at it first, Dr. Lang?
Okay, no worries.
Yeah.
That one is a little bit of a misconception, and I'll be the first to admit that I didn't know a lot about this until I learned a lot of things from my colleague Anna Tweet, who is still head and shoulders above me in farm to school expertise. That's part of her role here at SDSU Extension. So I will say that SDSU Extension has an awesome farm to school resource page with videos, guides, how to, and some really cool case studies. But there is this misconception that there is a ton of extra requirements or inspections required by the school. And in most cases, that's not true. Some schools will just have a very simple buyer's contract. If they're a larger school, they might ask you about your food safety plan, whether that is GAPS, which is usually a larger plan that's required by a lot of wholesale buyers, for example. So like, let's pretend you were so good at farm to school on your farm, whether it's, you know, your tomatoes or your potatoes, you might have to start doing GAPS from the produce side. There is the Food Safety Modernization Act, and that really is on a farm to farm basis. Those regulations apply to you incrementally based on the dollar amount that you're selling on your farm. So some of those things might be things that you need to take care of on your farm anyways. If you're a small fruit and vegetable farmer just getting started, the school might just have a very simple checklist of food safety questions and a very simple contract that they utilize. Now, on the meat side of things, there are things that are required to keep that meat safe, and I'm going to not get out of my wheelhouse and delve into that, but I know there are inspections and handling related to meat that producers need to meet. But a lot of that ties back to the butcher's shops that they're working with in the state anyways. So as far as like the USDA school lunch program saying thou shalt do this, this, and this, that is actually a misnomer. It's more the school's just, you know, having a conversation with the farmer and again, having some sort of a purchase agreement or contract. But there isn't really extra regulation unless the school has added that on a case-by-case basis. And that is Kristine's 2-cent understanding of how that works. But a great question. All right. Well, the great news is Blake is going to hang out with us in the background for the rest of this evening. And Sean, I'm going to welcome you and Liz back to the floor. And we look forward to learning all about the Local Foods Education Center and the projects that your students have been up to this summer.
All righty, thank you. All right, so I direct what's called the SDSU Local Foods Education Center. It's kind of a mouthful, but what it is our student farm and our teaching farm. And so these are my farm crews that I've had, at least most of them. So on the right was the 2023 crew, and on the left is the current 2024 crew. And so this farm is completely student run with me kind of overseeing it. And I also use it as a teaching farm for 2 courses that I teach during the semester. And so those are called Local Foods Production and Local Foods Harvest and Storage. And so what they do is kind of put you in the shoes as if you're a new farmer in a small, maybe like working on a small vegetable farm. And it's kind of giving you what you would need to know in the spring from when you decide to start farming up until harvest. And we cover topics like farm planning, and we use that farm plan to talk about things like season extension and irrigation. And then big picture, we talk about issues about finding and financing land. We talk about regenerative practices versus conventional. So when students come back in the fall, they take local food harvest and storage, and this kind of picks up now once we have produce up until the end of the season, what you would kind of be concerned about as a new farmer. So we talk about things like post-harvest, physiology and pathology, canning, seed saving, just practical skills that students can learn at the farm. But then we also read a book and we talk about that book. We talk about local food system components. We talk about different markets and food safety. And so throughout this whole year, you kind of get what it's like to be a new farmer within your own local food system. So it's a really, really cool thing that we offer here at SDSU. So the farm itself during the summer is actually run by students as well. So we have 4 full-time students working here right now. And we do kind of like conventional vegetable production with like plastic mulch. We have a 72 grape vineyard. We produce all of our transplants and plug trays. But we also kind of are interested in all these alternative growing methods. So as Liz Sattler is going to talk about, is we have a lot of our vegetable production in no-till production. We've experimented with like terminated cover crops and growing pumpkins in those. These are some mushroom buckets we have down here in the bottom left. We have a student interested in that. We use tarps for weed control. So we're trying all different kinds of things here. We're getting our high tunnel back. So a derecho took out our previous high tunnel, and it's been a insurance snafu to try to get our new one. But currently, July 2024 here, we have the skeleton of our high tunnel back. And so now we can start working in high tunnel production systems. So we're trellising cucumbers and tomatoes and doing lower and lean production for those. We talk about fertility management. We set up irrigation systems. We deal a lot with pest control, and we explore different methods. And I always encourage students, every time you see a pest, record what you saw, try to identify it as soon as possible. And, we can try to solve it this year, but then we'll also have that information for planning for next year. Like many of you in the audience, we experienced our fair share of flooding, which made weed control up until the middle of June practically impossible. But as you can see, they were smiling through it for the most part. This is just a photo. They were mostly not smiling through it. But yeah, our farm was practically underwater for the beginning of the spring. So we harvest everything, right? So we're a productive farm, and here's some turnips being sorted on our root washing table. And we package everything too. So we have a food prep room, and we take everything we harvest from the field, wash it, clean it, and actually package it as if we were going to sell it at a market. So all of our lettuce is bagged, all of our root crops are banded together. And we actually donate everything that we grow. And that's probably like the most rewarding part of this job, is that everything we produce goes directly to someone for free. And I always kind of joke that there's a market for every vegetable that we grow as long as we're giving it away. So we can grow things like radicchio that nobody likes, but we can give it away for free sometimes. But so half of our produce is donated to our local food bank on campus. It's called Jack's Cupboard. And that's that little market that you're seeing in these photos here. But the other half, we actually donate to the Brookings community. And we do that at the United Way Center. And they house the Brookings Food Pantry. And they also have a summer program called the Backpack Project, which gives school lunches to kids outside of school. So it's very rewarding what we get to do with all this produce that we grow. Something I started doing this summer is actually letting the students go on farm tours. So we had 2 farmers already take us in and give us their time. So Blue Sky Vegetable Co. and a Homestead Brew gave very educational presentations to the students. And then the last thing we try to do on this farm is actually do movie nights. So I tried this last year in September. We had a modest showing, but we're going to do it again this September. And we just kind of like invite anybody on campus or in the community to come, and we just play some kind of local food centric movie, and we just kind of hang out and talk. So with that, that's kind of us in a nutshell. I'm going to turn it over to Liz DeBoer now, who's going to talk about her cut flowers.
Yeah, so I have been working at the farm the past like 3 years, or this is my 3rd year. Last year I was part-time, but still was here. And Sean kind of got me to become the manager by being like, hey, you can practice with your cut flowers, because that's something I kind of want to do in the future. So he kind of sucked me in with that, which I'm still happy to be here. But yeah, I have no idea what I'm doing with any of this, in all honesty. So just kind of like seeing how it works. It's very nice at a place where there's very low risk to me personally to like try different methods of what could work for maybe potentially in the future becoming a cut flower grower. So getting started, just picking out the varieties. I started with a list of like 80 different varieties and knocked it down to, I can't remember how many I have now, but way less than that. And then planting the beds, which I actually used the farm plan that Sean had taught in the spring local foods class to plan out the flowers and get all the maturity dates and all that. And then seeding the trays, and you can see here there are different levels of maturity. because of the farm plan,
Mhm.
kind of cool stuff. So then there's bed prep, we tilled the plot completely, and then landscape fabriced it. Then we burned holes in the landscape fabric using our stencil that we made out of a piece of plywood. That's actually Liz there using a hole saw for the first time, kind of a cool thing. And then we used drip irrigation, just on top of it because flowers don't like overhead watering. And then we planted, and it seemed that every single time we would try to plant or weed or do anything in our flower garden, it would rain on us. So they kind of stuck through with me, went through some pretty rainy days in the flower field, but they're growing now, so that's good. We did some transplants and some direct seeding. And the direct seeding was kind of interesting. Not everything came up, so we're actually like trying to reseed and get things to come up now. So if there's holes in plots, that's why. But progress so far, another thing that I learned that we'd have to do because this is South Dakota and we have lots of wind. We had to put up netting for stability and wind protection for both the snapdragons, zinnias, cosmos, and there was one more. I don't remember the other one, but putting up this wind protection, essentially all of that we did was we pounded in 4 T-posts on the ends of, or end corner of each plot, and then put this netting down and kind of fished the flowers through it. And so far it's worked. We actually only have had 1 flower break off that I'm aware of, I think, so doing pretty good with that. So yeah, this is kind of just what it's looking like. These are actually pictures from today, so very up to date. Yeah, lots of activity going on, very cool. And then plans for the flowers. So the plan is to harvest them and donate the bouquets to Jack's Cupboard when we go there to donate every week on Wednesdays. And then at the same thing as the movie event, we're planning on doing a You Pick event before that to kind of draw more people in, hopefully, and also give the flowers a home. So that's all I've got.
Awesome. All right, now Liz Sattler.
Hello. All right, I'm gonna be talking about our no-till bed production here at the local Foods Education Center. So currently we have 1,900 linear feet of no-till production in place right now. This is split between 2 fields. Every time we go to plant a bed, there is a series of steps. We call it bed flipping. There are 6 steps to this process, and honestly, one person could complete all of these steps. But it is always easier to do something when you have more people to do it. So our first step is weeding. Obviously, when you're going to direct seed or transplant anything, you don't want to have weeds there already, taking up nutrients, taking up space, using essential water that those seeds are going to need to germinate. So weeding is the first step that we do in any bed prep that we do. Some tools that we use stirrup hoe, chopping hoe, and we have our own wire weeders, which are that middle picture there. We actually made those ourselves, thanks to Sean's crafty YouTubing.
Yep.
We made them out of some poles that we found, a hose clamp, and then we got 2 sizes of wire, just so you could have like a big one for some bigger weeds and a small one for maybe those not so established weeds. Our second step is called broad forking. This is a method that we use to get airflow into the soil and put oxygen in it, so plants have a better chance of growing and surviving. This also helps with drainage too. The tool is called a broad fork, hence the term broad forking. This isn't a step that we do every single time that we bed flip, but recently with how much rain we've had and how much rain there was in the spring, it's definitely a very useful thing to do. And the way that this works is you can stand on the broad fork and you push it down into the ground, and you take the handles and you tilt it back at about a 45-degree angle. And this pushes up the soil enough to where it makes a little hole or divot, whatever you want to call it. And you just do that throughout the entire bed. You go ahead about 1 or 2 foot after your initial one, and you just do that throughout the whole thing. That's a better picture of the broad fork itself. Our third step is fertilizing. In our farm plan, we have fertilizing requirements for each crop that we grow. Our fertilizers that we use are urea and blood meal, both for nitrogen. In our farm plan, it is set up so that for every bed flip that we do, each crop has a set amount of blood meal and urea that it gets. So we're using the same amount every time. Makes it easier for us to remember and to weigh out as well. And application for that is done by hand. We have 2 buckets that we use to spread the fertilizer with. Our fourth step is tilthing. Tilthing is just a method that takes the top inch of soil and kind of disrupts it a little bit. It's definitely a lot less invasive than tillage, which is a deeper intrusion of the soil. And the only reason that we really do this is to mix in those fertilizers, making it more accessible to the plants that we are planting. And this tool, very cool tool, it's called a tilther. It's a drill powered tool. You hook the drill onto a shaft, and when the drill turns on, the shaft spins and the tilthing mechanism underneath spins. And I don't know if you can see it really well in the picture, but there is a rope attached to all of this, and that rope is used to pull the trigger on the drill, keeping your hands away from moving parts and making sure you keep all your fingers. Our fifth step is called rolling. This is a step that we do to get any big chunks out of the bed that maybe the tilther didn't break down. It also flattens the bed, making planting a lot more ideal. And this tool requires some type of weight to be on top of it. We personally use a cement block, but this roller doesn't really work unless you have some sort of weight, like pushing down on it. It just isn't as effective if you do without it. And then our final step is called gridding. This just makes lines on the bed to help us with correct spacing and making sure our plants are in straight lines, or as straight as they can be. This helps with maximizing our bed space because, I mean, we do have a lot of it, but also beds only go so wide and so long. This tool works really well if you can roll it straight. We found that sometimes it is a little bit hard to do that, but it is extremely helpful in terms of transplanting, especially with spacing. You can go off those guidelines and you can do a lot of different spacing with that. And the tool itself comes with 3 different attachments. There's one with 4 lines, there's one with 3 lines, and there's one with 2 lines. We personally use the one with 4 lines a lot. You can do a lot with that. You can do 6-inch spacing or a foot or 18-inch. You know, there's a lot of different multiples you can do with that one. So that's the one we use the most, but we do have all the other ones too. And this is just some pictures of our bed space being used. That one on the left there, I think, is radicchio. That was a time when we didn't use the gritter for some reason. So there's a tape measure next to the bed to make sure that we got our spacing correct. The one on the right is from last week, I believe, and we were transplanting fennel. And we ended up transplanting and direct seeding that bed. That was a fun time for sure. And then the middle picture is, that's our greens. That's arugula, radicchio, head leaf lettuce, and collards there in that field. So yeah, that's it.
All right. Well, I'm going to open up the floor again for questions for our panelists, and perhaps while people are thinking of what they want to drop in the Q&A. Liz and Liz, no pressure, but I'm curious, what does the future have in store for either of you?
Well, I'm graduating in December. and currently not so sure. Ideally, I would have my own local foods product operation at some point, but that could be a few years down the road as I am a college student and am broke and can't buy land at this point. But that's ideally what would be happening.
I'm currently going into my sophomore year here at SDSU, so I have quite a bit of time before I can really go off and do my own thing per se. What I would really like to do, me personally, I'm not a horticulture major, I'm actually an ag education major. So my whole purpose in being here at LFEC was to just eat up as much knowledge as possible about local food and things like that. So hopefully I can put that knowledge back out into in a classroom setting and definitely get some hands-on experience with that as well.
Awesome. Well, for both of you, those sound like some really noble pursuits and very cool career goals. So, Sean, maybe a flip side of the coin, if anyone tonight is listening and they are thinking about going back to school, a career change, or they have young people in their life who are looking for what's next after high school, what types of students do you see in your local foods classroom, or maybe what's the 2-second elevator speech for why local foods is awesome?
Foods is awesome. The reason why it's awesome, especially for South Dakota, is it presents such different cropping systems than people are used to. Like there's corn and soybeans and wheat here, and we don't really get to see the tools or hear the stories or see the methods that people use at the small scale. And so if someone's coming, well, I guess, and the students that are in my class are kind of like half horticulture, half agronomy. And so a lot of the times it's sort of like a culture shock for the agronomy students, because I'm like, hey, here's something entirely different. And for the horticulture students, I'm like, here, now we're going to put this into action and plant it and start like growing some vegetables. And I think they like it for that reason. So it's something different to every student I get.
Awesome. And just a shameless promotion for our department and a little bit of recruitment, but if anyone's curious about the local foods education center, you can visit the SDSU website. If you're curious about any of the cool agricultural or horticultural programs and courses at SDSU, you can find all of that information on the SDSU website. And I see that Candy is dropping those resources in the chat for us. Sean, Liz, I'm going to ask that you hang out just for our parting words, and I'm going to do a very brief infomercial on some tough plants for tough conditions to round us out for the night. So last time I hung out and did garden hour with everybody, we talked about flooding. So on the opposite side of the coin, I figured I'd touch on some other tough conditions, some of which folks in the western side of the state and all the way probably into the central part of the state. I know there's been some pretty gnarly winds and some severe storm damage that came after many of us in eastern South Dakota experienced the flooding. And again, there was an earlier session of Garden Hour where Rhoda Burrows had polled the audience and asked what they were curious about, and deer came up. I think now it's mosquitoes are the nuisance, and I hear that mayflies are pretty bad in some parts of the state, according to a recent interview I read that featured John Ball. But I just wanted to give a few tips and tricks for anyone who might be facing wildfires, heaven forbid, later in the summer, or deal with the freak hailstorm. And I think all of us are constantly fighting deer. So I just want to highlight that there's some really cool resources from the Forest Service and especially from CSU Extension. And again, a reminder to folks to pay attention to John Ball's tree pest alert, because he covers everything from flooding to emerald ash borer to fires and everything in between. But some things to think about if you are in a fire prone area is thinking about some traits of tough plants. I'm a little hesitant to give a laundry list of recommended plants, but rather I wanted to suggest some types of plants to look for. So things with high moisture content, Things like succulent plant material, sedum, ice plant, anything that holds a lot of water in its leaves. I'll even throw out one of my favorites, which is moss rose, which has a beautiful array of flowers, but spoiler alert, the deer do love it. So great for fire, bad for deer. Sometimes you can't win them all. Having things that are short and close to the ground so that flames can pass over them quickly are very helpful. And having a low volume of dead, dry foliage. So this is where, staying on top of deadheading, maybe not having a lot of ornamental grasses or not having a lot of daylilies if the leaves are going to get droopy and dry up, or irises where the leaves are going to get droopy and dry up, things like that, or cleaning up that foliage and plant material. And I just want to say that this is no way an endorsement for any one plant. I am far from a home insurance agent, but just some things to consider. Some other things to consider about how you design your garden is to plant in islands and not in masses. So have pockets of plant material that are divided by other hardscape options, things that are non-flammable preferably. So again, breaking up that vegetation. Keeping plants healthy and well watered and hydrated goes a long ways in preventing that dried foliage. Mulching can help hold in that water, but if you're using things like pine bark or needles, things that have resin or will light fire really quickly, that's counterproductive to the cause. So being intentional with your mulching would be important. And again, back to deadheading, removing that dried foliage and seed heads. And hopefully this is not an issue for us this summer, but again, as we look to smokier skies and think about our neighbors up north, it is something to keep in mind. And I will just say again that the Forest Service has some excellent resources. Somewhere in my office, I have a really cool flip guide that I picked up one time when I was in Rapid City. So I would encourage you to check out those resources if you have more questions. Another thing that I'm almost afraid to say it out loud because then it will happen somewhere in the state. But inevitably we do get hail. And I know a lot of people, depending on their garden situation, have gone to using different forms of hail netting or hardware cloth to protect their garden. Those are awesome options to consider. If you live in a place where hail isn't as frequent, so you don't feel the need to cover your plants, if you do have hail damage, there are some things you can do. And again, if you live in an area where you have some landscaping around your house, for example, that you don't want to cover because that's not aesthetically pleasing, looking for plants that have thinner, finer leaves, grasses, things with long spikes that the hail won't, catch as much. So big, large leafed hostas, those are great fodder for hail to tear them apart. So again, smaller leaves, sturdier stems, plants that are short in stature. So again, there's just not as much physical area for hail to catch. And there are a lot of plants, even in our perennials, that don't mind a little bit of a beat down or a haircut from time to time. So thinking about perennials, I'll just pick on things like salvia and catmint because they come to mind. You can deadhead them in the perennial garden and they come back very readily. So those are just a couple of examples to consider. Or things like coreopsis that have those very fine leaves and aren't going to physically catch as much hail. Those might be some things to consider. So thinking more about, the next time you're at the garden center looking at a plant catalog, thinking about some of these physical traits. So we don't want big, huge leaves like our elephant ears, even though they're beautiful. They could catch a lot of hail and get a lot of holes. If you do experience hail damage, it is a-okay to cut back severely damaged leaves. We don't want to remove everything. So let's say half the leaf is ripped off. You could even give it a clean cut. If you're worried about transmitting disease, using a 10% bleach dip, not a bad idea to sanitize those pruners. But remembering that anywhere that hail damages a leaf, that can become a disease entry point. So trying to cut back some of that severely damaged leaf matter can be beneficial. And really what you're doing is kind of pinching back that plant and signaling to it, okay, it's time to grow more new leaves. Using a weak fertilizer solution and watering, keeping those plants watered after a hail event. unless you've gotten 4 inches of rain, then wait a little bit. But that will help revitalize the plant as well. And then remember to be patient. When it comes to things in the vegetable garden with hail, you might want to keep an eye out for any bruising or physical damage on the produce. Again, if it's something that you're going to eat right away, probably not a huge issue, but some of that bruising can certainly affect quality for storage life, or even, be maybe a risky disease entry point for canning or freezing or things like that. So just be cautious. And last but not least, the pesky critter that we are all always wondering about, deer. So the important thing to remember, why it's in bold, is that a hungry deer isn't picky. There is no plant that is truly deer proof. I grew up in West Central Minnesota in, like oak woodlands. We had lots of deer and lots of turkeys and raccoons and squirrels and all sorts of other fun things. But deer were happy to munch on many, many plants in our garden. Deer look at things like hostas and they think, oh my gosh, that's a delicious salad. Thank you so much for planting that for me. So keep that in mind. As indicated earlier, things like moss roses that are just really succulent and juicy and delicious, they absolutely love it. I learned last year through a series of unfortunate events that they love young sunflowers before they get really, really hairy leaves. So deer are happy to munch on all sorts of things. So some tough plant traits that you can look out for are odd textured leaves, things that are really fuzzy or really prickly or really leathery. Plants that have strong smells or saps, so things like mints, lavenders, alliums, or onions, so any of the ornamental stuff, things like milkweed that have that latexy sap, deer will usually leave those types of plants alone. And when all else fails, consider things like exclusion, deterrence, and again, falling back on plant selection. And I will get into a few more examples of what some of these plants can look like. First, I do want to highlight that there are a variety of deer deterrent recipes out there. I know John Ball has previously shared deer deterrent recipes in his tree pest alert as well. I believe his involves eggs, if I remember correctly. So these are things that can deter deer from plants, but they can also deter you. And you might also not want your pets around it or your children around it. So consider deer deterrents with caution, and remember that if it rains, it's likely going to wash off and you're going to have to reapply. But that is one thing to consider. This was a resource that I found, and I used it a couple of years ago, and I checked, and the website is still current, and it appears to have been revised and added to. So Rutgers, of all the places, did a survey with landscape and green industry professionals and basically created a rating system based on what people had actually observed in the landscape. So this is New Jersey. I have no idea if their deer are scrappier or less scrappy than our deer, but I thought this was a really cool database and it's searchable. And again, I think anytime that we can, much like Blake's research, anytime that we can involve the public in science, I think that's an awesome option. So I want to share that this is a resource you can check out for, get kind of a rating system for, is this a good idea to plant in my yard or a really bad idea? If you live in an area with really, really high deer pressure, I would focus on anything that is A for rarely damaged. And I would stay away from B, C, or D because you're probably just planting a deer salad bowl. Again, deer pressure can vary by location. So what are some examples of some deer resistant or rarely browsed plants? I want to share an example of a plant that has kind of a funky, soft, hairy leaf texture and has a funky smell. So this is Salvia garden sage. It's in the mint family, and there are a lot of things in the mint family that have funky smells, and many of them have odd textures to their leaves. So this is just one example. This is Pink Profusion. It was one of our trial plants at McCrory Gardens. I thought it was really beautiful. Other things to consider in the mint family that might be low growing, so also fireproof, would actually be thyme. So if you're looking for a low growing ground cover, that could be an excellent option to consider. Russian sage is another great ornamental example. And I know some of you might be looking at this and go, oh my gosh, Russian sage, it gets too big, it flops over, yada, yada, yada. I will share that there are some new, more compact, petite, well-behaved cultivars out there on the market. One that did really, really well for us was Denim and Lace. And here I have Sage Advice, which also did a nice job in our trials. But I will say that Denim and Lace stayed really, really compact. So if you're looking for a smaller plant that is deer resistant, that would be one I'd strongly recommend based on some more recent trial report data. This is one that I wouldn't necessarily think of as being deer resistant. And I don't know how many of you have interacted with this plant, but it's bugleweed or ajuga, which is actually what I tend to call it by its scientific name. But it is it can be kind of an aggressive ground cover, but this is a great example of that leathery leaf. So it's not a succulent leaf like a moss rose where it's kind of filled with water and all sorts of sweet, delicious goodness, but this is pretty leathery and tough. And if you step on it, it's actually somewhat accepting of being walked on. It'll kind of spring back a little bit, but again, a nice thick ground cover, and something that deer tend to not browse. Another example of a very funky leaf texture would be anything in the Brunera family, specifically Siberian bug loss, where you have really big leaves. And if you were to rub this between your hands, it's almost like rubbing sandpaper. That's how rough the trichomes or hairs are on the leaf. So this one was called Queen of Hearts. I loved it. It was absolutely beautiful, but I'm sorry to say it did not overwinter well in South Dakota. So I would look for some hardier versions of Siberian bug loss. But again, the concept I'm trying to drive home here is if it feels like a yucky sandpapery leaf, you probably don't want it in your mouth. Another one I think of that kind of fits this really hairy, awful textured leaf would be, oh my goodness, I just blinked on the name. It'll come back to me. Nope, still gone. Live television, we're going to keep going. All right, and last but certainly not least, I want to give a shout out to one of many awesome native plant options. So Anise hyssop Augustaceae is a great plant if you have lots of space in your garden. It is big, it's sturdy, it's bold, pollinators love it, deer don't like it. It does taste and smell like black licorice, hence the name. So it might not be a smell that you want in your garden as well, something to consider. Some other cool native plants, especially to consider for West River and drier conditions, would be Mariposa lily and mountain harebell. So one of the campanulas, and those are both beautiful native plants. And I highlight Mariposa lily because I feel like I've shared a lot of purple plants just by happenstance. And that is one that is not purple. So again, something to consider. You can dive way deeper on tough plants and deer resistant plants. We have more articles and resources on the SDSU Extension website. A huge shout out to the SDSU Native Plant Initiative, where you can learn about all sorts of cool native plants, because there are many more that would be rarely browsed by deer. You heard me reference the McCrory trials a few times, so I'd encourage you to check out the trial report webpage where we have a few years worth of trials ready to download. And again, there's some great resources from some of the other universities as well, including CSU, Montana State, and that very cool database from Rutgers. And I just want to wrap up Garden Hour by reminding everybody, if you haven't subscribed yet to the Garden and Yard newsletter, you should really do so. It's pretty awesome. We have some great articles. We keep trying to crank out timely topics. Sometimes I make the request and then the weather or the conditions change and we adjust the request and we make sure that we get in flood damaged trees, for example, or emerald ash borer was the news will be the news once it's sent out a little bit later this week. So you have that to look forward to. And the reason I highlight our newsletter is this is a great place to look for events. Sean talked about the movie night at the local Foods Education Center. Sean, myself, our graduate students, and many of our campus and extension colleagues are collaborating on the Specialty Crop Field Day, which will be on September 10th, which is a Tuesday from 4 to 7. And then the last stop that evening will be a tour of the local Foods Education Center. So that would be a great chance to meet Sean and maybe one or both of the Liz's and see what they're up to. And perhaps once we know a date for movie night, we can cross-link and cross-promote for that movie night too. So keep an eye out for that information. And as always, we shove a lot into an hour. So if you have any questions anytime at all during the week, no matter where you are in South Dakota, you can reach out to the garden hotline by email, by phone, or you can stop into any of these locations in person to get your questions answered and your plant problem solved. And with that, I'm going to take a quick peek at the Q&A and see where we're at. All right. There was a question about please send the link to the deer resistant sites. I believe Candy dropped that in the chat. And then if you're watching the recording after the fact, there is a QR code that you can use your phone camera to jump to that website as well. So Sean and Liz and Blake, thank you so much for joining us on Garden Hour. And I think we'll just wrap up the night with what's something you're excited about for the rest of this week in your research and working world.
Excited for the first tomato harvest. That's what I'm excited for.
Ooh, what kind of tomato are we harvesting?
Oh, BHN 5889.
Okay, so a nice red slicing tomato. That sounds delicious to me, but I have a soft spot for that one. Liz, anything you're excited for this week in the world of tillage reduction and cut flowers?
Well, we had our first flower harvest last week, so we'll have to continue up with that. So that's exciting.
Awesome.
And we have a whiteboard in here, and looking at it right now, it's got all of our transplant direct seed written on it, and there is a lot to plant this week. So looking forward to that.
Awesome. Good thing it's a nice hot week for it, right?
Right.
And Blake, how about you? What's on the horizon in the world of local foods and qualitative research?
Yeah, I am right now, the rest of my week is going to be diving into the next chapter of my thesis, which is all about building resilience in the South Dakota local food system. So I will be doing a lot of reading and trying to understand what makes a resilient food system.
Awesome. Well, we look forward to hopefully catching up with the local Foods Education Center. Maybe some of us can catch you in person, Sean, Liz, and Liz. Blake, we very much look forward to keeping an eye out for more of your research findings in their various forms. And I will just share that I'm excited to get some more event requests for SDSU Extension to work on and promote. So do sign up for the SDSU Extension Garden Yard newsletter, and we look forward to seeing you in person, whether it's on campus or at a collaborating farm in August or September. So with that, have a great evening, and same time, same place next week. And thanks again for joining Garden Hour.